good afternoon to everyone who's taken the time to be here with us to listen to this inaugural Tshekisho Biennial lecture. I am really excited to be here this afternoon in the heartland of South Africa, in the heart of our country, and I'm very delighted to say that I'm joined by my family members. My uncle is here, Dr. Masitela, and my cousin is here, Mamello Masitela. They're over there, so thank you for your support. I do feel like I am held by my people. Not to say you're not my people also. Dr. Mokwatsi here is one of my people also. And I just wanted to acknowledge those people and to also acknowledge you all for taking the time. I think the Tshekisho Biennial emerges at a moment of historical reckoning. This year, 2026, marks the 150th birthday of Sol Plaatje. So I see it as a bold and necessary memorialization of a great African. This name, Tshekisho, maybe we need to spend some time looking at it and understanding what it means. Tshekisho is a Serolong name that carries layered resonances that are spiritual, moral, and historical. The name itself means judgment. Branwillen notes that it evokes the biblical attributes of King Solomon. It also signified, I quote him here, signified Martha Plaatje's acceptance of God's will and judgment in letting her have another boy rather than the girl she wished for, close quotes. Additionally, its other layer is derived from the term go itshekisa, which is to purify or purification. Overcome with remorse, Willen tells us, at having sought to anticipate God's will, the name Tshekisho emphasized Martha's repentance. Her heart now purified for having presumed to express her own wish to have a baby girl. So as I said, the creation of this biennial is as timely as it is necessary. It is a reminder of the multifaceted nature of the genius we're talking about. An example to inspire a new generation of similar thinkers and writers, particularly Black youth with resonant artistic and intellectual missions. To quote from the brochure. The brochure further tells us that it is a critical engagement, a vibrant intellectual forge where emergent African literary thought is hammered out. The festival also adopts Plaatje's political undertones, spotlighting a rigorous ensemble of projects who are prefiguring storytelling and collectivization in post-apartheid South Africa. It tells us that Plaatje serves as an inspiration for this festival because he's a notable figure in South African history, politics, and academia. He achieved proficiency in 7 languages, working as a court interpreter for the British colonial authorities. He translated 2 William Shakespeare texts into Setswana and also edited the following newspapers: Kuranta ya Batswana, Tsala ya Batswana, and Tsala ya Batho. The brochure tells us that these proficiencies in linguistics, music, scholarship, and activism have been a model for South Africa's burgeoning artistic and intellectual communities, but can also serve as an inspiration for those interested in pursuing these fields of inquiry. The arts fosters holistic development within individuals and communities across domains of culture, socialization, cognition, and collaboration. It tells us that they hope to produce a generation of emergent creators, thinkers, and producers that resonate and also build on and reiterate Sol Plaatje's legacy. In other words, this biennial's invocation of Tshekisho, Solomon Plaatje's middle name, thus signals not commemoration alone, but critical engagement, a call to judgment on history, memory, and African agency. I wish to congratulate Tsiamo Malachi and his team on honoring this great son of the soil. And also I wish to thank him for considering me worthy to deliver this lecture, fresh from my own PhD graduation. I spent 4 years working in the archive of Solomon Plaatje's newspapers, Kurante ya Batswana, Tsala ya Batswana, and Tsala ya Batho. In a silent conversation with our forebears, the long dead, the forgotten, and the unknown, Ivan van Settima reminds us that we are ruled by the dead. He says, and I quote, "What happened 5,000 years ago, 500 years ago, 5 seconds ago, occupies the same time space in consciousness. We are not 20 years old or 50 years old or 70 years old. We are millions of years old. This is just a small span of time in which we move. Our attitudes, the way we treat people, the way we conceive of people, the way we are conceived of people by people is determined by how they see what has happened in the past. History, therefore, has nothing to do with 10,000 years. History is a living thing. We are ruled by the dead. Most of the books we read are written by the dead. Most of the buildings we walk among are built by people who are now dead. Most of the things we inherit, the thoughts, the attitudes, the prejudices come from the dead. So that to see history again is not to become involved in an academic exercise. To see history is to see ourselves anew, to feel life anew." Close quotes. Reading this historical newspaper archive of Sol Plaatje, of words or texts that were committed to paper some 120 years ago, was an intensely spiritual act of reconnecting with the past on my part. Retyping their words, letter by letter, was an act of restoration and a soul-satisfying correction of the record. For here, I could hear the fears, the worries, and the dissatisfaction of the long dead. You can also hear hope whispering, a hope and belief that the future will be better. What a unique position to be in, a journey anointed and chosen for me. I'm particularly pleased to be in Mangaung this afternoon, which is one of the constituencies that Plaatje served with great diligence and attention. A town where the South African Native National Congress, now known as the ANC, was founded in 1912. A colony in which Plaatje himself was born, here at Doornfontein Farm in the Boshoff district. And he used to mock the Orange Free State as the Orange Slave State, or put free in inverted commas. The smallest of the colonies, yet the harshest and the most brutal in the violation of black human rights. It is a colony, which is a province today, where women stood up in 1913 to protest against the passes led by Memudisa Pudi. Forget that what happened 43 years later, the famous 1956 on the Union Buildings March that gave us Women's Day on 9 August. It was here in Wynberg and Bloemfontein that women shot their fists in the air and declared that enough was enough from the oppressive colonial government policies. A few kilometers from here is Thaba Nchu, which was another constituency of Barolong that Plaatje serviced. It is a citadel of knowledge and black excellence. Names like Chief Fenyang, Chief Horonyane, Mr. Masisi are names that should be at the tip of our tongues because they did so much for the black communities all those many years ago. But they've been erased and forgotten. When writing about Thaba Nchu, here's a snippet that comes from Kurante ya Batswana in 1903. It said the town was booming since the recent introduction of a railway line, which resulted in the newspaper reaching the readers quickly, with most people reading it by Tuesday. It used to be published on Saturdays. There are many white traders and the town is being developed. Thaba Nchu Hotel is always filled with guests. The streets of the town are being repaired and fences are going up, the writer noted. This is Kurante ya Batswana of 25 April 1903. To complete a picture of prosperity, the river that runs through Thaba Nchu, I don't know if it's still there, people from Thaba Nchu can tell us, is reported to be flowing just as it did when Barolong first reached their land from Mothanapitsi. Before I digress, my assignment tonight, this afternoon, is to locate Plaatje in the new African movement. Perhaps I should start with this anecdote, which was really a story that appeared in Courant ya Batswana. There was a report from a Wesleyan youth Timiti or tea meeting, which was held at West End in Kimberley, where a man known as Morwa Mokoena delivered a speech about how he had no respect for women who wore dukes or head wraps. And he argued that women to be respected must wear hats and not dukes. This sparked what would become a marathon debate playing out in the letters section of Kuranta. A writer who identified themselves as ELP reacted with rage towards Mokwena's duke attack, which led to further letters from J. Chapman from Molepolole in Botswana, who agreed with Mr. Letiani and Mr. Lefenya on Mokwena's duke attack, and a letter from Mr. L. Jebetle, as well as J.J. Nkai, who called for Mokoena not to be allowed to write into Kuranta or to address people again. Nkai and Z.M. Rabanye's reaction to Lefenya's reaction to Mokwena's duke provocation further compounded matters. Joining the fray as well was Sariel Molukwani. The matter was finally settled by a letter from a group that was known as Maanya Pudi, which was a collection of Botswana students at Lovedale College. And they expressed their support for Mokwena's stance on dukes. They believed that women needed to wear hats and not dukes. In this little anecdote that I've just shared, we can see the changing face of the Africans, which was debated in the newspaper Courant ya Batswana. And unfortunately, it was debated by men only, a matter that affected women's choices. The men made the call on what women had to wear to be considered in keeping with the times. It was decided by them that this was conspicuously progressive, as Emma Hunter calls the younger generation. This debate further demonstrates what Jacob Dlamini, among others, has noted, that for the black elite, the onset of the modern world meant abandoning old customs for new ways. They converted to Christianity and deserted indigenous belief systems. They took on Western-style education and appropriated European clothing, as well as mores and forms of conduct. However, Dlamini asserts that they did not view this as mimicry. Instead, it was the adoption of modern ways as a sign of their active presence in the birth of the modern world. Dlamini invokes the words of Selope Thema, a key figure in the later years of the Black press, when he said, and I quote, "It is my firm belief that we can be Christianized without necessarily being Europeanized, and it is essential that it should be so, for we have qualities which are indispensable to human progress and happiness." Let's dive a little deeper into this concept of New African movement. The man that wrote extensively about this concept is Mtongela Masilela, who tells us that this movement spanned the century between 1860 and 1960. At this time, intellectuals located themselves in the rapid onslaught of early modernity in the context of a colonial South Africa. Masilela describes this as a historical intervention of the new African intelligentsia through political, cultural, and intellectual praxis in the construction of African modernity in South Africa. Drawing on ideas of civilization, education, and Christianity, the new African intellectuals sought to usher African communities into the modern world of the 20th century. Nearly all of them had been schooled in European missionary institutions, a system that was itself a product of colonial conquest across Africa. Though they valued what that education gave them, these intellectuals grew increasingly uncomfortable with the underlying project of reshaping Africans in a European image, and eventually pushed back against it. That resistance was not straightforward. It meant rejecting white dominance and Eurocentric thinking while still engaging with European modernity, not to adopt it wholesale, but to remake it into something distinctly African. This African modernity would move beyond inherited tradition without abandoning it, remaining in ongoing conversation with the past. At the heart of this project lay a difficult question that preoccupied these thinkers. Could one embrace the tools and frameworks of European modernity while simultaneously fighting the colonial and imperial systems through which that modernity had been imposed? That is a question. In this, one can deduce that the movement was a result of geopolitical and geocultural shifts that moved a society steeped in tradition to confront Western influence. This group of intellectuals needed to construct a new reality and a position for them, or rather position themselves and their people in a different world and a new age of the 20th century that was not always welcoming or accommodating of their presence in it. Masilela reveals that editors of the black press like Plaatje were conscious of themselves as new Africans, creatively establishing new epistemologies and new knowledges to rationally make sense of the historical meaning of the intervention of European modernity in African history. The early writings of Plaatje and Pixley Seme were among the early constructs of the new African movement, and Masilela links this to the founding of the Pan-African Association and the Pan-African Conference organized by Sylvester Williams in London in 1900. Bongani Ngqulunga writes that for Masilela, 100 years of the new African movement was marked by the emergence of cultural, political, and intellectual organizations, activities and ideas led primarily by peoples of African descent in Southern Africa to grapple with the challenges posed by the entrance of European modernity in the African continent. He mentions that the pioneer of this concept of New African was a man known as Theo Soga. And I can guess now that most of you in this room have never heard the name. But Theo Soga is the first ordained African minister who became a missionary, a journalist, and composed hymns. And he gave the likes of Alan Kirkland Soga, who became a newspaper editor. There's also Henderson Soga, who I believe was the first black vet in South Africa. So when you get some time, when you get home, please Google the name Theo Soga and just check just the prestige of this family. Anyway, Ngqulunga tells us that this wrestling of Soga, of imagining a world in which traditional African communities were dealing with a strain of European colonization, missionary evangelization, and Western education, serves as a marker in periodizing this movement. Many other Africans would have to negotiate this violent entry of European modernity into the African continent and adapt it to their lived realities as Africans. The response was the creation of cultural, political, and other associations and organizations. And in here, we find newspapers, journals, books, and letters. Masilela calls newspapers intellectual infrastructure or infrastructure of thought that fueled the new African movement. Why do we think that newspapers matter? This is where I come in. This is where my research and my interests come in. We see newspapers as a primary platform for debate, critique, and cultural formation. They enabled the dispersed intellectuals to speak to one another across regions. They created a public sphere for African modernity. Hundreds of articles, letters, editorials, and notices appear in these newspapers. So just to touch on my methodology, how I did my thesis, is that I had to come up with a diagnostic frame for the new African idea that I called the changing face of the native. So this was my way to frame how Plaatje and his contributors tracked, debated, and at times lamented the transformation of African life under colonial modernity. It was theorizing Black modernity in real time. And then I've come up with the 5 interconnected dimensions of the New African Intellectual Project that come out of these newspapers. The first one is on education and the missionary question. The second, gender, feminism, and the changing position of women. The third, health, the body, and colonial disease. The fourth, land, sovereignty, and African political consciousness. And fifth, religion, tradition, and the negotiation of spiritual modernity. Across all 5, the newspaper enacts precisely the tension that Masilela identifies as at the heart of the New African movement, an attempt to embrace European modernity while transforming it into an instrument of African self-determination. Let's briefly dip into some of these dimensions. The first one being education and the missionary question. The New African intellectual tradition was, in its origins, a product of the missionary school, as I mentioned earlier on. Nearly every significant Black intellectual of the early 20th century, Plaatje included, was formed within the European missionary education system. The 1912 coverage of the official opening of Tiger Kloof Institution in today's Northwest exemplifies this ambivalence. The report records Reverend Reid's declaration that the wisdom of educating the native is no longer a debate, and Dr. Mears' prescription that industrial work must not be neglected. The newspaper reproduces these statements with apparent approval, yet the framing is telling. The native is educated by white benevolence, trained to serve their chiefs and communities, and the occasion closes with God save the king. The report does not critique this framework directly, but the accumulation of detail, the precision about the school fees paid by natives, and the careful recording of institutional power suggest a narrator who is watching, not simply celebrating. By 1915, the newspaper's engagement with education had sharpened considerably. The piece on Fort Hare and Don Jabavu is explicit. It talks about the students there who will see the benefits of being taught by someone of their color. This is a new African claim in compressed form. The assertion that race matters not merely socially but epistemically, that the educated African is best positioned to educate other Africans. The article does not reject European education. It insists on African authority within it. This is the characteristic move of the New African intellectual, not the wholesale rejection of the missionary legacy, but its appropriation and redirection. Under gender, feminism, and the changing position of women, one of the most striking features of the newspaper Tsala ya Batho in this period is the sustained attention given to women, their education, their legal status, their mobility, their bodies, and their emerging presence in public life. The newspaper lends itself to annotations of feminist content, a self-conscious awareness that the transformation of African life was inseparable from the transformation of African womanhood. The 1914 report on the marriage of the daughter of Chief Chweni of the Baka people is among the most vivid pieces of literary journalism in the archive. Described as the prettiest and most up-to-date Botswana wedding ever seen, it catalogs the dress, the bouquet, the 2-story wedding cake, the couple received with showers of rice. The pleasure in this description is New African pleasure. The educated, dressed, photographed African woman was an emblem of arrival into modernity. Yet the piece does not erase tradition. Chief Chweni slaughters 32 animals. The ceremony is embedded in chiefly culture. This is African modernity in dialogue with African tradition, precisely as Masilela theorizes it. Elsewhere, the newspaper's feminist consciousness is more explicitly critical. The 1912 report on young women as young as 15 attending concerts and dimiti, the hand-wringing about their education and behavior, reflects the patriarchal undercurrents of even the most progressive Neo-African thinking. Yet the newspaper also records, without apparent condemnation, the debate over intermarriage between Zulus and Botswana, the voice of women writing about marriage and domestic life, and the celebration of Miss Alice Masiza's matriculation pass in 1914 as a historic achievement. What emerges is not a uniform feminist position, but a contested one. A newspaper genuinely working through what the Neo-African woman should be, and in doing so, registering the fault lines within the Neo-African intellectual project itself. Under health, the body, and colonial disease, the body was a central preoccupation of Tsala ya Batswana and Tsala ya Batho, and the coverage of health in the 1910-1915 period is one of the richest and most complex dimensions of the archive. Disease, tuberculosis, infant mortality, venereal disease, is never treated simply as a medical problem. It is always a political one. The 1914 summary of the 450-page Tuberculosis Commission report is a masterclass in the newspaper's critical reading practice. The Cape Times summary it reproduces attributes TB prevalence among blacks to adoption of civilized habits, a change from their openness and freedom of life to town locations, and indulgence in deleterious alcoholic liquor. However, the newspaper prints this framing, but the very act of reprinting it in a black publication constitutes an implicit commentary. The Neo-African reader is invited to see what the Commission cannot, which is that the civilized habits causing tuberculosis are not freely adopted, but structurally imposed by the mine compounds, urban locations, and labor systems of colonial capitalism. Under land sovereignty and African political consciousness, no issue carried greater political weight than land. The 1913 Natives Land Act, which Plaatje would document and condemn in native life in South Africa, cast its shadow over the 1910 and 1915 archive. In 1913, the piece on the Union Buildings celebrations captures the newspaper's political acuity at its sharpest. When Pretoria papers seek ideas for a pageant, they consider and abandon native war dances as stale and forgotten. The newspaper's editorial reply is cutting people dance when they are happy, but they can't when they cry for their relatives in Gaul and others hounded out of their homes. In a single sentence, the ornamental African, the dancing native of the colonial imagination is replaced by the political African, the dispossessed subject of a settler state. Lastly, under religion, tradition, and the negotiation of spiritual modernity, perhaps the most philosophically ambitious content in the 1911-1915 archive is one written by Reverend Willoughby in 1914 when he addressed African religion. It was published in Tsala ya Batho. Willoughby, a white missionary, offers a reading of African religious practice that the Neo-African intellectual tradition could recognize and build on. Sympathetic, analogical, and insistent on the spiritual seriousness of African cosmology. His account of the rain-making ceremony at the grave of Mutibi, the black bull, the sunrise sacrifice, the communal prayer, the sudden rain, is recorded with the precision and reverence of a witness. His conclusion is remarkable in its context. He says, and I quote, "My friends, one race will never understand another by exaggerating its peculiarities. Antipathy and sarcasm are not roads that will lead you to the heart of another man. The road there is called sympathy." Close quotes. The newspaper's decision to reprint this address at length is itself a Neo-African act. Here is a European missionary voice being used to legitimate African spiritual practice in the eyes of a black readership that had been taught to be ashamed of it. Against this, the pieces of the Sabbath debate and the new prophet baptizing followers in the Orange River register the anxieties of the new African intellectual about religious disruption from below, the complaint about young men playing sport on Sundays, the warning about new prophets mushrooming. These reflect a new African investment in order, discipline, and the moral seriousness of Christian modernity. The new African was not simply a celebrant of African tradition, he was also its reformer. In conclusion, I'm sure some of you would be happy to get to conclusion. In conclusion, what Plaatje's journalism across the 1901 to 1915 period constitutes is something that scholarship on African intellectual history. Okay. In conclusion, okay, can I get my moment now? In conclusion, what Plaatje's journalism across the 1901-1915 period constitutes is something that scholarship on African intellectual history has been slow to name with sufficient precision. It is a black public sphere in the Habermasian sense, that's Jürgen Habermas, but reconstituted on African terms. It is a discursive space in which private persons, chiefs, miners, teachers, women, readers in compounds and mission stations come together through print to reason publicly about the conditions of their collective life. The newspaper's recurring theme of the changing face of the native is the register in which this reasoning takes place. It is neither a lament nor a celebration, but an ongoing negotiation between tradition and modernity, between African authority and colonial imposition, between the world the new African intellectual inherited and the world he was trying to make. Plaatje's genius and the genius of the community of writers and readers that Tsala Yabato assembled was to hold these tensions open rather than resolve them prematurely. In this sense, the newspaper is not merely a historical record of the new African movement. It is among its most sustained intellectual performances. To read it carefully is to encounter a black intellectual tradition that was theorizing modernity from the inside, in real time, in multiple languages, across the full range of human experience. The changing face of the native was never simply the native who was changing. It was the native who was watching himself change and writing about it. Thank you for your attention. I will now hand over to the MC who will tell us what's to come next.